Hello again, I'm Andrew Linanne, and you're very welcome to the second edition of Film Network Ireland's One Take Review. So, in One Take Review, we take a current cinema release and we take it apart and put it back together again, and we do it all in one take. And the reason we do it in one take is because we are committed to a simple and truthful reviewing style, and also because at the present time we can't really afford any clips or any fancy graphics, so it's just me for the moment. Now, so far, we've actually managed to average, I guess, one review per year, but we are definitely looking to become more prolific in 2022, and we're going to start with Paul Thomas Anderson's Liquorice Pizza. So Paul Thomas Anderson is a last man standing on a couple of different fronts. He is, along with Quentin Tarantino and Christopher Nolan, he is the last kind of holdouts for shooting on traditional 35mm film as opposed to digital. And he's also one of the last of the kind of mid-budget auteurs who is still actually making features and who hasn't been lured away into television. So his work is, I think, definitely worth supporting. I've had a peculiar relationship with Anderson myself. I really liked Boogie Nights, but then I did kind of go off him quite a bit for a couple of years. Magnolia, personally, I didn't care for. I thought it was like a kind of an overwrought version of Altman's Shortcuts. So I just felt like every character had to have a very kind of extreme emotional catharsis. It seemed kind of like overcooked, overacted, and then in the midst of it all, out of nowhere, there's a rain of frogs. So why precisely there was a rain of frogs, it seemed just like that Anderson had read Charles Fort and thought that that was a good idea, and maybe it was just to give the actors a break from crying, I'm not sure. But Magnolia I didn't particularly care for. And as well, There Will Be Blood, although I know that it would put me in somewhat of a minority, and I only offer my own kind of humble opinion. There Will Be Blood, I didn't particularly care for either. I felt like, unusually for Anderson, the central characters were kind of quite one-dimensional, and to some degree, I think Anderson didn't have sympathy for those characters, which is probably what makes the difference. And then the whole thing culminates in what I could only describe as a kind of no-holds-barred scenery-chewing contest between Daniel Day-Lewis and Paul Dano. It seemed like a kind of an improv almost. You've got Daniel Day-Lewis bellowing drainage in a way that would make Al Pacino blush. And you've also got this kind of iconic line, which I can't quite remember. I think it was like, drink your milkshake. I mean, he could have said, I siphon off your low-fat yogurt, and it would have made about the same amount of sense. So those movies I didn't care for at all. But just to prevent this from turning into a diatribe, The Master completely turned me around on Anderson. I think The Master was very much the kind of everything that I felt was lacking in There Will Be Blood. So it was, to me, a much more subtle and a kind of much more mysterious and a much more moving film. And I think The Master kind of represents the beginning of the very mature phase of Anderson's career. So after The Master, he seems to have figured out what his view of the world is and what his particular style of filmmaking is. And he kind of carves out a very specific niche for himself, directing. They're kind of difficult movies to describe. They're kind of like strange dramas, and they always tend to focus, or one of the primary themes in Anderson's films has always been a relationship between two characters, where the characters are very much drawn to each other, but they're also kind of antithetical to one another. So they develop these sort of strange and inexplicable codependent relationships where they're very strongly drawn to each other, but they can never quite connect. But at the same time, they can never fully relinquish each other. And you have to feel like there's probably a kind of philosophical view underlying this, that Anderson probably views the world as being sort of composed of sort of warring opposites, and these opposites can never really fully be reconciled. So maybe in a kind of an optimistic scenario, they can absorb the part of themselves that they're missing from the other, but in the kind of non-optimistic scenario, they wind up destroying each other. So even Anderson's Thomas Pynchon adaptation, Inherent Vice, he seemed to frame that movie around the relationship between Joaquin Phoenix's sort of hippie detective Doc Sportello and his arch nemesis, who is Bigfoot. I'm not even going to try and pronounce this here. You know, the character played by Josh Brolin. So that is kind of the main underlying theme in all of Anderson's films, and Licorice Pizza to some extent is a continuation of that, albeit in a kind of a lighter and a more comedic tone. So this movie is set in the early 1970s, and it is the story of a kid called Gary Valentine, who is 15 years old. He's quite precocious. He's been a sort of a child star, and he's also a bit of an entrepreneur and a kind of hustler. So one day he encounters the assistant of a high school photographer who is an older woman. She is 25 years old. Her character is Alana, and he immediately becomes very preoccupied by her, and he thinks, well, this is the woman that I'm going to marry, whereas she is a little bit more reluctant, naturally enough, about the entire idea. So then the film sort of focuses on their relationship over the course of, it seems to be about a year, and it is typically with Anderson, it's quite a strange relationship. It's a platonic relationship which is always threatening to become a romantic relationship, but never quite does. So in the course of that sort of period of the film, Gary becomes a waterbed salesman. So nowadays, if you're a young man and you want to make your fortune, you probably go into NFTs or crypto or something like that. But in the 1970s, the waterbed, I guess, was the way to do it. While he's getting involved in waterbeds and pinball machines, she tries to become an actress and also begins to develop a kind of an idealistic desire to change the world. So she starts working for a politician who's running for mayor. It's a kind of a, again, typically with Anderson, it's a very strange relationship. One of the things that's very cool about it is that they're constantly distracted by other people throughout the movie, and they're as much kind of at loggerheads with one another as anything else. But whenever the other character is in danger, they immediately become fiercely protective of one another. So they have this kind of mysterious bond which is there from the very beginning, and we don't know exactly what it's based on. Now, insofar as this is a coming of age movie, which I'm not sure that it is, it's not clear who it's a coming of age for, because Gary is quite a precocious character and seems to be, he has very little parental, there's no father figure there, so he seems to have become an adult in his own way, whereas Alana, although she's the older character, she's in a kind of sprawling and a claustrophobic kind of Jewish family. She hasn't yet sort of developed as an adult. So part of what may connect them is that Gary has become an adult, but in a quite adolescent way, whereas Alana is struggling to become an adult, but in a kind of an adolescent sort of way. So I guess I would put Licorice Pizza in a series of period films which cover roughly the kind of late 1960s and early 1970s, and they've been directed by American directors who are roughly of the same age group, so they're basically kind of looking back on the period in which they grew up. And I would include it with films like A Simple Man and Inside Llewellyn Davis by the Coen brothers, and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino. Period movies, for me, I tend sometimes to find them a bit contrived, a bit sort of artificial. But what is unusual about these movies is that they're less historical and more kind of personal. And they kind of look at the periods from inside those periods themselves rather than sort of consciously looking back on history. And I think the comparison with Once Upon a Time in America is quite interesting because they're both kind of quasi fictional movies. So, one thing that fascinated me about Licorice Pizza as I was watching it was I went in not knowing a great deal about the movie at all. And I kept wondering how much of this is actually based on truth or how much of this is based on reality. It seemed too, kind of, in some respects, too random and strange to actually be made up. As it turns out, most of Licorice Pizza is actually has some basis in reality. So the character, central character Gary Valentine, is based very closely on a friend of Anderson's, whose name, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, is Gary Goetzman, who's now a producer. He was indeed a child star and a waterbed salesman back in the 1970s. And all of the other characters that drift into the movie, they're all sort of real characters. Sean Penn's Jack Holden is basically the legendary actor William Holden. Um, the politician that Alana works for towards the end is a real character. And Bradley Cooper's amazing sort of performance is as John Peters, who's a former hairdresser turned powerhouse producer and paramour of Barbara Streisand and various other people. So Peters kind of gamefully allowed Anderson to create a sort of slightly caricatured or hypercharged version of his character. So the movie is kind of fascinating in that everything in it has some kind of basis in sort of reality, but it's more of a kind of a dreamlike or a poetic reimagining of that period and those characters. So the main question to ask would be, I mean, is it a good movie? I know that a few people have said that maybe it's a lesser Anderson movie. But personally, I didn't think that at all. I think it's a fantastic movie. I think that just because a movie is maybe lighter in tone or more comedic, it doesn't make it necessarily a lesser film. So I'd say that, like the Coen brothers, this is a movie that knows its world and knows its characters very, very well. And I'd say also, like the Coen brothers, it's a film that understands that the best comedy quite often derives from an understanding of character and an understanding of the often kind of weirdly specific worlds that characters inhabit. So this is a movie that's anchored around two really great central performances and their debut film performances from Cooper Hoffman, who is the son of Philip Seymour Hoffman, and Alana Haim, who is in a band, but she has never been in a movie before. Now, these are great performances because they are two not sort of stereotypically perfect looking leads, but they are kind of effortlessly charming and they really seamlessly kind of combine with their characters. They're two great performances. I think Alana is the more striking of the two, but it may be just that the film is more structured around her. But not only are the central performances really great, all the cameo roles that kind of weave in and out of the story, they're all quite note perfect. Harriet Sampson Harris has a small cameo as a drama agent, which I think has already become legendary. Bradley Cooper as John Peters. I may be doing Bradley Cooper quite a disservice, but I feel like all the rest of his career is going to be a footnote to his performance as John Peters. So they're all fantastic performances. The movie is needless to say, very, very well made. But when I compare it with Inherent Vice, which is a movie that I liked, but I think that wasn't entirely successful, one of the things that's really good about the novel Inherent Vice is that it creates a very specific sense of a time and place. And it's a kind of time and place that you would like to live in and bask in. I think that that's what Licorice Pizza does as well. It just has this sort of poetic, dream-like recreation of a specific time and a place. And it is somewhere that you would want to go back to and revisit again and again. And I think, like the Coen brothers, it seems like a film that will repay repeated viewings. So I guess the moral of the story is I would recommend go to see Licorice Pizza, go to see it in 35mm, particularly if you can. Keep 35mm alive. And that's pretty much all for now. And if you would like to find out more about the tireless and awesome work of Film Network Ireland, please check us out at wearefni.com, and check us out again when we return with another one take review. It will be in 2022, I'm quite sure. So in the meantime, take care of yourselves.